Welcome to Episode 3 of the U.S. Battleships of World War II series. For this episode, we are covering the Colorado class, the last of the standard type battleships, as well as the North Carolina class, the first of the U.S. fast battleships. If you haven't seen the previous episodes, be sure to check those out, which cover earlier classes in service such as the Wyoming and New York classes, along with the other standard type battleships of the Nevada, Pennsylvania, New Mexico, and Tennessee classes. Before we hop into the classes, I'd like to thank today's sponsor, World of Warships. World of Warships is a free-to-play naval warfare-themed game available on PC. You're able to play as aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, and face real-life players in 12 vs 12 arenas online. There's new content being released every month, whether it be new ships, in-game nations, cosmetics, or even ship classes. You're able to command your favorite warships in high definition, and for me personally, I focus on the American battleship lines and enjoyed using New York, and they have a number of ships mentioned in today's video. If you're a warship enthusiast like me, be sure to download World of Warships using the link in the description. If you're new to the game, during registration, use the code DDAY80th to get 200 doubloons, 1 million credits, 7 days of premium account time, a free ship after you complete 15 battles, and 3 special D-Day missions after 9 battles, only available for a limited time. As the 80th anniversary of D-Day recently occurred, World of Warships wants to commemorate the heroes of D-Day with a special event. As American and Allied ships had a major role during the landings in France, during this event, you'll engage in epic warfare inspired by June 6, 1944, and help relive history's most pivotal moment on the seas. Be sure to participate in exclusive in-game events, unlock commemorative rewards, and pay homage to those who changed the course of history. During this limited-time event, players can unlock new ships that will be debuted in the game, special D-Day player versus computer and player versus player missions for new and existing players, new commemorative historical commanders, and special patches, skins, and customizations. Be sure to download World of Warships, and if you don't play on PC, World of Warships is available on consoles as well. Be sure to use code DDAY80th for special rewards. Now, back to the video. The product of the 1917 battleship building program, like many of the past programs, was a progressional development in American battleships. Taking the same dimensions, propulsion, armor, underwater protection, and secondary armament from the Tennessee class, the new Colorado class saw one major change. The last of the standard type battleships would be equipped with 16-inch guns. Instead of 12 14-inch 50 caliber guns sitting in 4 3-gun turrets, the Colorado class saw a main armament of 8 16-inch 45 caliber guns in 4 2-gun turrets. Though development of a U.S. Navy-built 16-inch gun design was already underway, this shift in doctrine was in response to intelligence that the Imperial Japanese Navy was developing and building 2 16-inch gun-equipped battleships of the Nagato class in 1917. Back in August 1916, 4 new battleships were authorized by Congress, and by January 1917, all were ordered. These 4 ships were to be Colorado, Maryland, Washington, and West Virginia. Standard displacement when built for the Colorados was around 33,000 tons. Maryland, the second ship of the class, was the first to be laid down in April 1917 and was commissioned first in July 1921. The other 3 ships, Colorado, Washington, and West Virginia, were all laid down from May 1919 to April 1920. However, the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 would take a toll on this class. With the limiting of battleship tonnage for the world's major powers, scaling back was part of the deal. In the US, Maryland was already commissioned and in service, while the Japanese government gave pushback against the cancellation of their 2 Nagato-class battleships, which they were allowed to finish. Compensation for this deal was the US was allowed to complete Colorado and West Virginia. Ironically, Washington would be the battleship of the class that would not be completed due to the Washington Naval Treaty. Launched at 75% completion, her hull was later used for ordnance tests and sunk. Colorado was launched and later commissioned in August 1923, while West Virginia was commissioned in December 1923. As noted earlier, secondary armament, anti-aircraft arrangement, and torpedo tubes stayed the same as the previous Tennessee class. Maryland would be the first U.S. battleship to have an aircraft catapult installed in her fantail in 1922, paving the way for older classes to feature catapults for spotter aircraft, an extremely important asset. She, along with Colorado and West Virginia, would have 2 catapults, one on turret 3 and one on the fantail. The 3 remaining Colorados would have their torpedo tubes removed in 1928 to 1929, and their 8 3-inch anti-aircraft gun complement removed and upgraded to 5-inch 25 caliber guns in their place. The Colorados would see the least amount of upgrades in terms of older battleships before World War II. All three would serve in the Pacific Fleet from commissioning up to Pearl Harbor in 1941. Colorado would be the only Pacific Fleet battleship not at Pearl Harbor during the attack on December 7th, as she left in June 1941 for Puget Sound Shipyard in Washington for a modernization. In February 1942, she left with a list of upgrades, including side bulges, which increased torpedo protection and buoyancy, now giving the ship a beam of 108 feet. 2 5-inch 51 caliber guns were removed, bringing the complement to 10, and her anti-aircraft suite was upgraded, with 4 1.1-inch 75 caliber Chicago piano quad mounts and 14 20mm guns, along with a better radar and fire control suite. In company with many older U.S. battleships, Colorado was part of Task Force 1, the initial West Coast defense against a possible Japanese invasion in early to mid-1942. She would serve as a deterrent against Japanese forces in the Fiji Islands, New Caledonia, and New Hebrides in late 1942 and 1943. She would have 6 more 20mm guns added throughout this time period. When returned back to the combat zone to take part in the Gilbert Islands campaign in November 1943, she would bombard the Apamama and Tarawa atolls. After this, she headed to the Puget Sound for another modernization from late 1943 to January 1944. All 1.1-inch quad mounts were removed and were replaced with 6 quad 40mm mounts and 4 twin mounts, and the 20mm single mount gun count came to 42. 2 more 5-inch 51 caliber guns were removed, lowering her secondary armament down to 8 guns. Her radar was also upgraded, and her Turret 3 catapult was removed. After participating in the bombardment of Kwajalein Atoll in late January 1944 and Enewetak in early February for the Marshall Islands campaign, Colorado would go back to Puget Sound yet again for another overhaul. Back in service by late April, Colorado was prepared for the Marianas Islands campaign set for June, where she began bombarding Saipan on the 14th. Acting as an invasion force safeguard against the Japanese force if they broke through during the Battle of the Philippine Sea on June 19th to 20th, Colorado patrolled the waters off Saipan until the island was secure on July 8th. Moving to Guam in the same chain, she provided days of preparatory bombardment before the island was invaded on July 21st, and gunfire support the day of. She moved to Tinian a few days later, where she took Japanese 6-inch gunfire from shore. Colorado was pummeled by 22 rounds, killing 43 crew and injuring 97. She would stay on station until early August, where she was headed back to Puget Sound again for repairs, modernization, and an overhaul. During this time, her aft cage mast was removed and replaced with a shorter tower structure. Her 4 40mm twin mounts were replaced with 4 40mm quad mounts, bringing her total up to 40 40mm guns. With her updates, she made her way to the Philippines in early October. When she arrived off Leyte in late October, the invasion was already in full swing. Supporting these landings for the next month, Colorado was hit by a kamikaze on November 27th, killing 19 crew and injuring 72 sailors. After supporting the invasion of Mindoro in December, she was part of the bombardment forces for the invasion of Luzon in early January, where she was hit by a 5-inch shell in the forward superstructure, killing 18 crew and wounding 51 sailors. On station till mid-February, she would retire and then make her way in March to Okinawa to bombard the island up until the invasion began on April 1st. With more than 60 days operating off Okinawa supporting the American advance, she would retire in late May, returning back to Okinawa in early August, as the war was coming to a close. She would support the American forces on their way to Japan for the official surrender in September 1945, and would make 3 runs for Operation Magic Carpet post-war. Awarded 7 battle stars during the war, Colorado was placed in reserve in January 1947, and eventually sold for scrap in July 1959. Maryland, the first of the Colorados in service, sat alongside Oklahoma on the land side of Battleship Row during the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Less vulnerable from Japanese aerial torpedo attacks that morning, Maryland would be the least damaged of the battleships in the water that day, with a 1,760-pound armor-piercing bomb striking her forecastle below the waterline, causing minimal damage. A second bomb would strike her near frame 10 and cause minimal flooding. However, the blast killed 4 sailors and injured 14 more. Right before New Year's 1942, Maryland would leave Pearl Harbor for Puget Sound for permanent repairs due to the attack. She would receive modifications similar to her sister, Colorado, soon after the attack. However, Maryland had previously received the torpedo blister upgrade along with 4 1.1-inch quad mounts back in 1941. During this early 1942 fit-out and overhaul, she received splinter shields for her 5-inch 25 caliber anti-aircraft guns, along with an additional 16 20mm mounts, upgraded radar, and fire control. Like Colorado, she would join Task Force 1 covering the West Coast and then go to Fiji in November to defend the sea lanes to Australia, In February 1943, she gained 2 more 1.1-inch quad mounts and 32 more 20mm guns, coming out to 48 total. Radar and fire control again was upgraded. Into 1943, she would be based in New Hebrides and would operate in the South Pacific until August. After stopping at Pearl Harbor, Maryland was a flagship for the bombardment force at Battleships Island during the Gilbert Islands campaign in November, but was plagued with communication issues due to the shock of the main battery salvos. Maryland's part in the Marshall Islands campaign in early February 1944 consisted of bombarding Roy and Kwajalein Atoll. After this action, Maryland was sent to get her largest modernization yet. All 50 caliber machine guns and 1.1-inch quad mounts were removed, and 2 5-inch 51 caliber guns were removed, leaving 10 5-inch guns for the secondary battery. New additions included 6 quad and 4 twin 40mm mounts, totaling 32 on the ship. The 20mm gun count was brought down to 40 from 48. Her aft mainmast was cut down considerably, with guns sitting on top, and her turret 3 catapult was removed. After this major modernization, Maryland was off to Saipan for the Marianas Islands campaign, where she was hit by a Japanese aerial torpedo on June 22nd while at anchor. Hitting her in the bow, her damage was limited. However, 2 sailors were killed. Needing to steam across the Pacific in reverse to limit damage to her bow, Maryland arrived at Pearl Harbor and a new bow was fit to her in 34 days. In August, she was shipped off to take part in the bombardment during the Palau Islands campaign, and on September 12th, she took part in the bombardment of Peleliu and would be on call for support until October. Ahead of the invasion of Leyte in the Philippines in late October, Maryland, along with a number of battleships, provided pre-invasion bombardment support. During the early hours of October 25th, she was part of the battle line during the Battle of Sarugao Strait, the last battleship versus battleship action during the war. However, with a bit of an outdated radar at this time compared to some of the other 5 battleships in the task force, she wasn't able to lay down any salvos until the range closed enough to make accurate shots. Laying down 48 16-inch rounds in 6 minutes, it appeared that shots from the 2nd and 4th salvos hit their mark on the vastly overwhelmed Japanese battleship Yamashiro. The next month, Maryland was hit in late November by a kamikaze between turrets 1 and 2, with its bomb penetrating the main deck and exploding. Due to the large fire and explosion, 31 sailors perished and 30 were wounded, and Maryland needed to retire to Pearl Harbor for major repairs. Here, what was left of her aft cage mast was removed entirely and replaced with a shorter structure, and the 4 twin 40mm mounts were replaced with 4 quad 40mm mounts, coming out to a total of 40 40mm guns, and the 20mm count was back to 48 guns. With repairs completed in February, she took some time for training and getting the ship worked up. Maryland would make her way to Okinawa for a pre-invasion bombardment starting on March 26. She would be on station throughout the beginning of the invasion, and was hit by another kamikaze on April 7th, this time on top of turret 3, which did not penetrate. Unfortunately for the gun crews, they were eviscerated, with 10 sailors perishing, 6 missing, and 37 wounded. Maryland would stay on station for another week, but would then retire for her last major modernization. All casemate 5-inch 51 caliber guns were removed, along with all her 5-inch 25 caliber anti-aircraft guns. They were replaced with 8 twin-mount 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns, 4 mounts on each beam. Her conning tower was replaced with a lighter 1.2-inch thick tower, and the 20mm armament was taken down to 18 twin mounts, with 36 total. She would also receive more modern radar and fire control directors. By the time Maryland was worked up and back in service, Japan had surrendered. Maryland would receive 7 battle stars during the war, and would make 5 trips for Operation Magic Carpet. She was placed in reserve in 1946, decommissioned in April 1947, and sold for scrap in July 1959. West Virginia, the last of the Colorados, was moored outside of Tennessee during the attack on Pearl Harbor. She was in a very vulnerable position for aerial drop torpedoes, and she would be heavily damaged during the attack. Within minutes of Japanese planes flying over Battleship Row, she was hit by a probable 7 torpedoes, creating an extremely heavy list to port. To avoid capsizing, the crew was ordered to flood the void spaces and blisters on the starboard side. Along with the torpedo attacks, West Virginia was hit by a 1,760-pound armor-piercing bomb that went through the main deck and destroyed the port-side casemate secondary armament. With the ship settling into the harbor and on fire, the crew was ordered to abandon ship, with 105 sailors killed and 52 wounded. The complex salvage of West Virginia began straight away, and by May 7, 1942, she was floated off the harbor floor and brought into dry dock for more repairs before she would be sent off to Puget Sound in mid-May 1943. Over the course of summer 1943 to June 1944, West Virginia underwent an extensive rebuild, with her look emulating the Tennessee-class rebuilds. Additional torpedo bulges were added, making her total beam 114 feet, making her unable to traverse the Panama Canal's 110-foot wide locks. 3 inches of horizontal armor were added across the main armor deck, along with 2 additional inches over the machinery spaces. Her secondary armament was completely updated with 8 twin-mount, 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns, 4 mounts on each beam of the ship. With the additional armor and new secondary armament, the original conning tower was removed and replaced with a lighter Brooklyn-class light cruiser-style tower. West Virginia received 10 40mm quad mounts and 40 single 20mm mounts for her protection. She was given the most modern radar and fire control equipment at the time of refit. After trials working up the ship and training the crew, West Virginia made her way to the Philippines to fight against the Japanese once again in October 1944. West Virginia provided bombardments supporting the invasion of Leyte, where she quickly sent more than 250 16-inch rounds and 1,500 5-inch rounds against positions on October 19th. As one of the 6 battleships in the battle line during Surigao Strait during the early morning of October 25th, West Virginia was one of the most potent battleships in terms of firepower and fire control out of the older battleships. West Virginia would fire first against Yamashiro, laying down 16 full salvos against the battleship during the 14-minute engagement. She was deemed the most successful out of the 6 American battleships, with rounds probably landing on Yamashiro on salvos 1, 2, and 6, helping lead to her demise. She would stay on station throughout November and would support the landings in Mindoro in December. In January 1945, she provided shore bombardment for the invasion of Luzon and Iwo Jima in mid-February. West Virginia would stay on station until early March, where she headed to Okinawa to start shore bombardment before the invasion. She was hit by a kamikaze on April 1st, the first day of the invasion, where it hit the superstructure, killing 4 sailors and wounding 7. The aircraft's bomb did not detonate after it penetrated a deck, likely saving many sailors' lives. West Virginia would stay on station until the end of June. During the year, West Virginia would have her 20mm complement upgraded to 64 total guns, 58 singles, 1 twin mount, and 1 quad mount. Along with the gun upgrades, her radar and fire control were upgraded as well. She would return back to Okinawa in early August, when the war was coming to a close. She would arrive in Tokyo Bay in late August, and was present during the official surrender of Japan on September 2, 1945. She would stay in Tokyo for a few more weeks, and then would head back to the U.S. She received 5 battle stars during the war. West Virginia would take part in 3 Operation Magic Carpet trips before the end of 1945. She was prepped for the Reserve Fleet in 1946 and decommissioned in January 1947. She would be sold for scrap in August 1959. With the advent of the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, the overall purpose was to stop the arms race between the United States, United Kingdom, Italy, France, and Japan. For our discussions, a major piece of the treaty was the limitation of battleship building until 1931, with a future extension until 1936, which was brought on by the London Naval Treaty of 1930. Each major nation was limited to a certain tonnage of battleships, and the treaty allowed the United States and Japan to finish 2 battleships each, the U.S. Navy's Colorado-class ships, Colorado and West Virginia, while Japan completed Nagato and Mutsu. The United Kingdom was also allowed to build 2 new battleships, however, with a design displacement of 35,000 tons and the main battery limited to 16-inch guns. The immediate consequences for the United States were the scrapping of several of its older U.S. battleships and writing off the newest class that was under construction, the South Dakota class of 1920. Consisting of 6 ships, the South Dakotas were the next step from the Colorado class, featuring a main battery of 12 new 16-inch 50 caliber guns and a secondary armament of 16 6-inch guns with around a 40,000-ton displacement. All laid down from 1920 to 1921, they were all scrapped before launched. In 1928, initial design concepts for a new battleship class were underway in anticipation for the battleship building holiday ending in 1931. Development was slowed due to the London Naval Treaty of 1930. In 1935, more serious design concepts started coming to fruition as the treaty would end. In 1936, some members of the General Board of the U.S. Navy argued that battleships needed to keep up with the new fleet carriers with over 30-knot speeds. But during 1936 and 1937, it was decided the next battleship class's main focus was armament and protection, with speed being a nice-to-have. The Second London Naval Treaty of 1936 introduced escalation clauses due to Japan's withdrawal from the naval treaties, allowing 16-inch guns to be mounted on the 35,000-ton limited ships. The current front-running design for U.S. planners was 12 14-inch guns and 3 quadruple turrets and armored to counter 14-inch guns. In July 1937, the Secretary of the Navy authorized the new class to upgun to 16 inches, replacing the 12 14-inch guns and 3 quadruple gun turrets to 9 16-inch guns and 3 3-gun turrets, 1 super-firing pair in the front of the ship, and 1 turret on the rear end of the ship. This upgunning made it an unbalanced ship, with heavier guns than its armor could withstand. After 35 final design proposals, the 2 ships of the North Carolina class were finally set for the slipways. North Carolina was laid down in October 1937, launched in June 1940, and commissioned in April 1941, while Washington was laid down in June 1938, launched in June 1940, and commissioned in May 1941. The 2 new fast battleships featured 9 16-inch 45 caliber guns and 25-inch 38 caliber guns and 10 dual mounts, 5 mounts on each beam. For anti-aircraft protection, they had 16 1.1-inch guns and 4 quad mounts, and 12 50 caliber machine guns. The ships featured watertight spaces between the armor belt and outer hull for their torpedo protection. Turbines, boilers, and their respective machinery were combined and separated into 4 machinery rooms, helping with their torpedo attack survivability as well. Top speed was 28 knots, and they had a cruising range of 17,450 nautical miles at 15 knots when commissioned. Armor consisted of a sloped 12-inch belt at 15 degrees to counter 14-inch guns, and a total of 7 inches of deck armor. Barbettes in the armored conning tower had a maximum thickness of 16 inches, with main turret faces being 16 inches thick, sides 9.8 inches thick, and roofs being 7 inches thick. Post-commissioning tests found that both ships had heavy vibrations from the propeller shafts at speed, which then led to machinery spaces. These vibrations had affected fire control directors, and was caused by both pairs of inboard and outboard propellers resonating against the hull in machinery spaces. As North Carolina was built in Brooklyn, New York, and was based there while undergoing testing, she was sent in and out of New York so many times to fix the problems she was soon dubbed the Showboat. The problem was fixed on both ships by changing the inboard propellers from 3 to 5 blades and adding additional bracing to their machinery spaces. Both North Carolinas were on the East Coast undergoing shakedown and training cruises during the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. These nearly 45,000-ton battleships at full load were kept on the East Coast to counter German battleship Tirpitz if it made a breakout into the Atlantic. North Carolina would receive 40 20mm anti-aircraft guns before New Year's 1942. Continuing her trainings, North Carolina arrived at Pearl Harbor in July 1942 and soon joined the invasion task force for the landings on Guadalcanal, which took place in August 1942. She would play an important role in the Battle of Eastern Solomons in late August, their 3rd carrier battle of 1942. Escorting the carrier Enterprise, North Carolina put up a furious wall of anti-aircraft to fend against Japanese dive bombers and torpedo bombers. She had multiple near misses from bombs, and a Japanese plane strafed the deck, killing 1 sailor. North Carolina was noted to being a critical piece to Enterprise's defense, downing a confirmed 7 aircraft and possibly a few more. This battle helped solidify the fast battleship's role during the war as carrier escorts, providing much-needed anti-aircraft protection for carriers while boasting high-caliber firepower to deter possible surface targets. In mid-September, off the Solomon Islands, Japanese submarine I-19 sent a spread of 6 torpedoes into a task force consisting of the carrier Wasp and other vessels, sinking Wasp and a destroyer. Some of the torpedoes continued miles away and into North Carolina's task force, with 1 torpedo hitting her on the port side of Turret 1, killing 5 men and injuring more than 20. With a massive hole in her side, the ship's modern construction, safety systems, and damage control prevented North Carolina from being a casualty. She was still able to sail at speed, heading to Tongatapu in the Tonga Islands for temporary repairs, and eventually to Pearl Harbor for permanent repairs in September to November. Here, she would remove her 50 caliber machine guns and replace her 1.1-inch guns for 15 quad 40mm Beaufort mounts. Also, this is where she would gain the distinctive visual feature to differ her from her sister Washington, Stryker's Bridge. This platform, on level 7 of the superstructure, was requested by North Carolina's executive officer, Commander Joe Stryker, to help assist him direct fire during air attacks after the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. Back in service, she would sail with her sister Washington to cover convoys and supply operations around Guadalcanal until March 1943, where she went back to Pearl Harbor for upgraded fire control and radar equipment. North Carolina would embark on escorting duties for amphibious forces during Operation Cartwheel, the extensive island capture campaign to neutralize the Japanese-held Rabaul. In September, she was back in Pearl Harbor for preparations for the Gilbert Islands campaign starting in November 1943, where she was in the role of carrier escort, and in December, she would bombard the island of Nauru and escorted the carrier Bunker Hill during her strikes on New Ireland. During the Marshall Islands campaign, starting in late January 1944, North Carolina escorted carrier forces as well as bombarded Kwajalein, Namur, and Roy, sinking a cargo ship in the Atoll's lagoon. She escorted carriers during the air raid on the Japanese stronghold Truk in February 1944, and would provide anti-aircraft fire protecting carriers during hit-and-run raids in the Marianas Islands area in the same month. North Carolina would provide anti-aircraft support during the raids on Palau and Wale in late March, supported the landings at Hollandia during the New Guinea campaign in mid to late April, provided escort for another raid on Truk in late April, and bombarded a few islands in the Caroline Islands in early May. Back to Pearl Harbor to repair her rudder in May, she was then off to support the Marianas Islands campaign in June. Along with protecting the carriers with her anti-aircraft complement, she bombarded Saipan mid-June and would be on station protecting the fleet carriers during the Battle of the Philippine Sea on June 19th and 20th, shooting down 2 planes during the battle. After a few more weeks of supporting operations off the Marianas, she headed back to Puget Sound in Washington State for an overhaul, wrapping up in October. Back in the West Pacific in November, she supported the landings during the Philippines campaign and would fend off kamikaze attacks. In January 1945, North Carolina would escort carriers during the strikes on Formosa, Indochina, China, and the Ryukyus. In February, she escorted carriers during their raids on Honshu, and she would participate in fire support in the bombardment of Iwo Jima until February 22nd. North Carolina would bombard Okinawa and provide carrier escort throughout the campaign, and notably on April 6th, she shot down 3 kamikazes and was hit by a friendly 5-inch shell, killing 3 men and wounding 44 more. She would shoot down 3 more kamikazes in mid-April and head to Pearl Harbor for another overhaul. Back with the fleet in early July off the Japanese home islands, North Carolina supported the carrier strikes on industrial complexes on the islands and around Tokyo specifically, also providing naval bombardment support. Supporting the initial occupation landings in Japan in late August, she arrived in Tokyo Bay on September 5th after the official surrender of Japan on September 2nd. She would take part in Operation Magic Carpet, returning servicemen to the U.S. after the war, and will receive 15 battle stars for her service, the most of any battleship during the war. By war's end, her light anti-aircraft suite did not change too much, with a total of 60 40mm guns over 15 quad mounts, and maintaining 36 20mm mounts. After the war, she was overhauled and would partake in training cruises off the East Coast and the Caribbean into mid-1946, being decommissioned in June 1947. There were some possible plans to modernize her and convert her in the mid-1950s, but this never took place. She was stricken from the Naval Registry to be scrapped in 1960. However, was saved by a campaign to raise funds for her conversion to museum ship. With $250,000 needed for preparing a new site, getting the ship ready to display, and to pay for towing, the Save Our Ship campaign began and raised $300,000 from North Carolina schoolchildren and other sources. Located in Wilmington, North Carolina, she opened to the public in October 1961 and is still open to commemorate the battleship's history, along with the 10,000 North Carolinians who gave their lives during World War II. After Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Washington would receive 20 20mm mounts and stay on the East Coast for trainings. She would eventually make her way to the United Kingdom in March 1942 to join the Royal Navy Home Fleet, where she would serve as part of the escorting force for transports headed to the Soviet Union, and serve as a deterrent for the German battleships Tirpitz. In mid-July 1942, Washington was called to the Pacific, first making her way to New York for an overhaul before heading through the Panama Canal and arriving in Tonga on September 14, 1942. Performing escort duties for convoys during the ongoing Solomon Islands campaign, she mainly acted as a deterrent for Japanese surface forces trying to attack Guadalcanal. With the American fleet carrier count dwindled down to 1, Enterprise, due to the sinking of Hornet and Wasp and the damage to Saratoga, Washington's presence, along with the new fast battleships, was even more critical. Washington continued to protect convoys into mid-November for Guadalcanal. On the night of November 14th, Washington would head into her most famous action, the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. Along with new fast battleship South Dakota and 4 destroyer escorts, they would face off against Japanese battleship Kirishima, 2 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 9 destroyers north of Guadalcanal. Right after midnight on November 15th, Washington would open fire alongside South Dakota, making it the first time multiple U.S. battleships would take part in a ship versus ship battle. Essentially a barroom brawl, 2 destroyers were quickly sunk, with the 2 others retreating due to damage. Along with South Dakota, Washington fired on cruisers and destroyers with their 16-inch guns and 5-inch guns. South Dakota, having a major electrical short circuit 30 minutes after midnight and under heavy Japanese fire, soon retired, which left Washington to fend for herself. An hour after the battle started, Washington located Kirishima and opened fire, neutralizing Kirishima soon after, which sank a few hours later, along with a Japanese destroyer. The first U.S. battleship versus battleship fight of the war was won by Washington, which fired 75 16-inch rounds against Kirishima, with around 20 being hits, based on post-war research and interviews. Washington would stay in the waters off the Solomons until April 1943, providing convoy escort. In May, she was off to Pearl Harbor for much-needed repairs, likely where she replaced her 1.1-inch mounts for 15 quad 40mm mounts, an increase of 20mm mounts to 67, and removal of 50 caliber machine guns. For the next few months starting in July, Washington would escort convoys and be involved in trainings off the New Hebrides for the upcoming Central Pacific operations, and additional operations continuing into November. Washington took part in the bombardment of the Gilbert Islands, and she would bombard the island of Nauru along with her sister in early December. Screening carriers into January 1944 for the Marshall Islands campaign, Washington bombarded Kwajalein. On February 1st, battleship Indiana caught in front of Washington, causing Washington to ram her, destroying her bow. She was quickly sent to Majuro for temporary repairs, then Pearl Harbor for a temporary bow, and then back to Puget Sound for a new bow. Arriving back in the Pacific in time for the Marianas Islands campaign in June, she took part in the screening carriers and bombarding Saipan, as well as Tinian and Guam. She also took part in the Battle of the Philippine Sea on June 19th to 20th, protecting carriers, and would head back to the Marshall Islands and remain there throughout August. Washington took part in the Palau Islands campaign, bombarding Peleliu and Anguar in September. She would support carrier strikes on different island chains throughout October, including those on Okinawa, Luzon, and Formosa. Washington was with the U.S. fleet during the battle off Cape Engano, sinking 4 Japanese carriers during the larger battle of Leyte Gulf. In November, Washington supported carrier strikes against Okinawa, China, and Tokyo, and would support the operations off the Philippines and air raids off Formosa into February 1945. She would take part in the shore bombardment of Iwo Jima in February, along with escorting carrier raids off the home islands, and in March and April, took part in bombarding Okinawa. Staying off Okinawa until May, she headed back to the west coast in June towards Puget Sound, and would be undergoing an overhaul when the war ended in September 1945. Her anti-aircraft complement by war's end included 60 40mm Bofors, along with 83 20mm guns. Washington was prepped to take part in Operation Magic Carpet, bringing troops home from Europe back to New York later in 1945. For her actions during the war, she received 13 battle stars and was taken out of service to be put in the reserve in June 1947. In June 1960, Washington was stricken from the Naval Registry and unfortunately was not as lucky as her sister. She was sold for scrap in May 1961. Before wrapping up the episode, I want to thank today's sponsor again, World of Warships. If you're a warship enthusiast like me, be sure to download World of Warships using the link in the description. If you're new to the game, during registration, use the code DDAY80th to get 200 doubloons, 1 million credits, 7 days of premium account time, a free ship after you complete 15 battles, and 3 special D-Day missions after 9 battles, only available for a limited time. Thanks for watching episode 3 of the series. Here are a few graphics illustrating what we just covered. Stay tuned for the next episode.